Kim Wagner is a senior lecturer in British Imperial History at the Queen Mary University of London. One day, the most peculiar email he's ever likely to read dropped into his inbox. Talking to PRI radio station in 2018, Wagner recalled, "I received an email from a family who had a skull and didn't know really what to do with it." Wagner subsequently arranged to meet the family, and they told Wagner that they'd inherited the skull from their parents. The mom and dad had taken possession of it when they bought a pub, the Lord Clyde, in 1963 in the southern English seaside town of Walmer. They'd found the skull languishing under a pile of junk in the back room. The skull was in rather poor shape, though. Yellowed by age, it was missing its jawbone and several teeth, with the remaining molars loose in their sockets. So it's fair to say that it hadn't been cared for as carefully as it might have been. When the skull had come to light back in 1963, it had caused something of a sensation, including coverage in the local paper. There had even been pictures of the pub's owners proudly posing with the grisly trophy. The BBC recounted in April 2018. But in a different age, the current owners of the skull were far from happy to have this gruesome artifact in their possession, and so they contacted Dr. Wagner. Moreover, this wasn't just any old random skull, it was a skull with a documented history. That took the shape of a handwritten note inscribed on a tattered piece of paper and obviously very old. The 170-word document had been carefully folded and inserted into one of the skull's eye sockets. And the contents of the note immediately engaged Dr. Wagner, as they were profoundly relevant to his academic field, the study of the British Empire. Quoted by the BBC, the note starts, "Skull of Havildar Alam Beg, 46th Regiment Bengal North Infantry, who was blown away from a gun amongst several others of his regiment. He was a principal leader in the mutiny of 1857 and of a most ruffianly disposition." The mutiny referred to was a mass uprising of Indian soldiers and others against British rule. But Wagner still needed to verify that the skull and the note were truly connected to one another. As he wrote in his 2017 book, The Skull of Alam Beg, "The first thing I had to do was to confirm that the skull itself matched the story. If, for instance, it turned out to be that of a 90-year-old woman, then that would have been the end of it." As a result, Wagner passed on the skull to the Natural History Museum in London. There, Dr. Heather Bonney examined it. She concluded that the skull was from a mid-19th century male, in his 30s, most probably of Asian descent. There was no sign of violence, however, but this was not surprising as it might seem. If you're tied to the mouth of a cannon that fires, while your torso will be blown to bits, your head will most likely be unharmed. So this skull had belonged to a man actively involved in what the British have historically called the Indian Mutiny. Indians, unsurprisingly, have a different name for the event. Some Indian historians, for instance, call it the First War of Independence. They see it as an early blow in India's battle for liberation from Britain, a freedom that eventually was achieved in 1947. Regardless of the name given to the 1857 conflict, Dr. Wagner told PRI that it was perhaps the largest anti-colonial uprising in history. The British actually ruled India through an agency called the British East India Company, and it controlled the country with the use of 300,000 Indian troops known as sepoys. The uprising started in May 1857 and had largely been suppressed with great brutality by June 1858. The revolt was started by the sepoys, but it soon spread to other sections of Indian society. There were 50,000 British troops in India at the time, and full-scale battles were interspersed with brutal massacres. The Indians were finally defeated by British forces led by Sir Colin Campbell. He was later made Baron Clyde, after whom the pub where Alam Beg's skull ended up years later was named. Alam Beg was one of the rebel soldiers. The note found with his skull describes how he and others waylaid some British citizens fleeing to the safety of a fort. They subsequently shot dead a Dr. Graham and a Reverend Hunter, along with the latter's wife and daughters. The note goes to describe Alam Beg as being 5 foot 7.5 inches tall and age 32 at the time of his death. It also records that a Captain Costello of the 7th Dragoon Guards was present at Beg's execution, and Costello was the man who brought the skull from India to England. During his search, Dr. Wagner discovered letters written by Andrew Gordon, an American missionary in India. Gordon had known both the Hunter family and Dr. Graham, and he'd also witnessed the execution of Beg. This pinned down the location of the events to the city of Salcott in Punjab, in modern-day Pakistan. Determined to find out more about Beg, Dr. Wagner then made the journey to Salcott. The city had been the scene of a pitched battle between sepoys and British troops led by General John Nicholson. The sepoys were heading for Delhi, but Nicholson's force caught up with them at the Ravi River. Some 1,100 sepoys were killed. Beg was with them and must have been captured. Wagner's research has shown that Beg was most likely a Sunni Muslim who hailed from northern India. The nature of his execution, in fact, had an awful logic to it. Without the physical body, which would naturally be destroyed by the cannon blast, both Muslims and Hindus would be unable to carry out traditional funeral rites, making this an especially appalling punishment for them. While Wagner was unable to find any other documentary evidence about Beg, Captain Costello's life yielded more results. Costello was born in County Mayo, Ireland, into a landowning family. As was then custom, he bought a commission in the 7th Dragoon Guards in 1851. He subsequently landed in India in 1858 after the uprising was all but over and was posted to Salcott. Costello eventually left the army in August 1858, returning to England with his grisly souvenir a few months later. How the skull ended up in the Lord Clyde pub remains a mystery, but the fact that it was Baron Clyde who finally snuffed out the rebellion seems to be an extraordinary coincidence. And it appears that Alum Beg might not be the only one whose remains were taken to England. In 1911, the Illustrated London News reported that the ghastly memento of the Indian Mutiny has, we are informed, just been placed in the Museum of the Royal United Service Institution at Whitehall. It's a skull of a sepoy of the 49th Regiment of Bengal Infantry who was blown from the guns in 1858 with 18 others. The skull has been converted into a cigar box, as we see. As far as Dr. Wagner's concerned, he has duty to Alum Beg's remains, and that's to return them to India. Although he's been unable to trace any of Beg's living relatives, he's quite clear that this is the right thing to do. I'd like for Alum Beg to finally be put to rest in a respectful manner after he's been kept in various boxes and attics for more than a century, Dr. Wagner told PRI.